Yeah.
All right, everyone. Zoom audience, let me know that you can hear me. Back there, computer in a second. I think I have it. I think I have everything right. All right, thanks everyone for coming out for another installment of our second Saturday Civil War series. I just have a few announcements before we get started with our speaker. Anyone who hasn't visited Captain Thomas Ashby post yet, and actually, can everyone hear me? How's the volume here? Good? Good, okay. Captain Thomas Ashby post located just over my right shoulder here. We are open every Saturday, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. for tours with our docents. I would encourage everyone to check out the Ashby post if you haven't already been there after our program today. Diane, for our speaker, one of them was kind enough to draw a few names for our raffle, and I forgot them, so hang on one second. Right, so the winners for our raffle today: Jim Mayhew, Cheese Balding, Colleen McGrath, and John Hall. You can collect your books in the back of the room. Thank you for supporting our raffle. We will close out our 2024 series next month with Dr. Elena Roberts of the University of Pittsburgh. She will be discussing Black Slaves and Indian Masters, a new story of Reconstruction in the West. She will discuss the 5 tribes: the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminoles, and Reconstruction in Indian Territory following the Civil War. We'll take December off for the holidays. We'll return in January with Matthew Hankinson of the Armstrong County Civil War Roundtable. His talk will be Blood, Courage, and the Maltese Cross, Personal Stories of the 62nd Pennsylvania. Of course, many veterans of the 62nd called the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and the Captain Thomas Ashby Post home for several decades following the Civil War. So it should be an appropriate, very interesting talk. In February, we will have Rachel Nicholas. Rachel is a graduate student at West Virginia University. She has served for many years as a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park, and just several months ago, she was hired as the new historian at Gettysburg National Military Park. She'll be here to discuss the African American community who called Gettysburg home before and during the battle. The rest of our 2025 slate that I announced last month is on our website, so check out all the speakers we have coming in. We have some great speakers coming next year. I hope all of you will continue to come out and support the program. Last month, I announced our symposium for 2025, put together based on your feedback from earlier this year and from previous years. Our 2025 symposium will be Our Battle Flags Were Tattered, the Maryland Campaign. It is April 11th and 12th right here at the Andrew Carnegie Free Library and Music Hall. The symposium is sponsored by Civil War Trails, so we thank them very much for their support. We will hold the symposium next year in Music Hall, so we have more seating, we have more comfortable seating. We'll open the symposium on Friday evening, April 11th. We'll have some refreshments, we'll have a cash bar, Arsenal Cider, our local Civil War themed hard cider distillery. Will be here on hand for tastings and for bottle sales. Really good stuff, perfect complement for the symposium. Opening the symposium on Friday evening will be hometown favorite Harry Smeltzer, who will discuss some of his recent research on Albert Magilton and the Pennsylvania reserves in the Maryland campaign. That evening, we'll have a live podcast recording of the Antietam and Beyond podcast with John Banks and Tom McMillan. Still trying to figure out what that's going to look like, but plan for it to be interactive, maybe some trivia, maybe some interviews with some of our speakers who will be here. It's going to be fun. If you haven't listened to the Antietam and Beyond podcast, I highly recommend checking it out on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back here Saturday morning with our usual full day of lectures. We'll welcome Dennis Fry as our first speaker, former chief historian at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park. He will be talking about Lee's Albatross, or Harper's Ferry, during the Maryland campaign. One of my all-time favorite historians. Really excited to bring him here. After Dennis, we'll have John Uptack, park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. His lecture will focus on the Battle of South Mountain. He has several books out on South Mountain. He's an awesome speaker. His battle walks programs are always some of the most popular at Gettysburg. So I was really happy when he told me he'd come out for the symposium. We have several of his books downstairs. I just ordered another one that came in several weeks ago, so check out some of his books downstairs. After lunch, we'll have a lecture from Scott Hartwig. Scott is the retired chief of interpretation at Gettysburg National Military Park, author of the magisterial 2-volume recent study on the Maryland campaign. He will be speaking on Antietam, the soldier's experience, using post-war letters and accounts to help us understand the soldiers and how they interpreted the battle and its aftermath. Like I mentioned, this was put together from your feedback, and the majority of the people said that they wanted Scott Hartwig, so I'm glad to be able to deliver him here. Following Scott, we'll have a lecture from Ashley Whitehead-Lusky, Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. She'll be speaking on Nothing Can Be Half So Melancholy as a Battle Won, Sharpsburg Civilians and Antietam's Aftermath. Then closing out the day on Saturday will be my great friend, my co-author, Kevin Pollock. He'll be speaking on the Loudon Valley campaign in late October, early November 1862, the unofficial close to the Maryland campaign. We're gonna have our usual raffles. We have some raffles this year. We'll do that again. We always have an expansive book sale. I just took in a huge collection of Civil War books last month. So I need to work on going through those. We'll get those priced. Have a big book sale this year. Several of our speakers will have books here for sale with them. I've heard from other authors who plan to attend the symposium. They'll have books here for sale as well. Ticket sales are open. It's a good thing we're moving to Music Hall because I've sold enough tickets where if we were going to be downstairs in the studio for the past several years, I'd probably be sold out within the next month. We're doing really good on ticket sales. We have plenty of seats. Tickets are $85. That includes all of the programs on Friday and Saturday. It included the refreshments Friday evening, breakfast and lunch on Saturday, snacks, drinks, and stuff throughout the day. Of course, all proceeds from the symposium benefit the Captain Thomas Espy Post and our ongoing Civil War programming. If you don't have tickets yet, you can get them online on our website. I'm also happy to help you at the conclusion of our program today to purchase tickets there as well. Just stop by the desk here and see me. Back to today. Today we welcome Eric Mohney. I ask all of our speakers before they come, send me a brief biography, paragraph maybe. A lot of times I have to trim them down. Eric sent me one sentence. I don't need to do any trimming there. Eric is an independent researcher, a founding member of the Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer for History Society, and an Army veteran. Thank you for your service, Eric. And a former Gettysburg podcaster. Now, I got to know Eric like many of you got to know Eric as the beauty, the brains, and the brawn behind the Addressing Gettysburg podcast. Several years ago, I was driving down Baltimore Street in Gettysburg. I spotted Eric and Matt walking down the street. Like anyone would do, I slammed on the brakes, I whipped into a parking spot, and went out to across them at the beer garden at Farnsworth House. So like any good fanboy would do. But I asked both of them to come out here to Carnegie for a lecture. Matt came 2 years ago this month. He was here. We had a lot of fun there. Now 3 years later, 3 years after meeting him, we get to have his counterpart here. So ladies and gentlemen, Eric Mohney.
As John Eric said, my name is Eric Mohney. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I want to thank everybody who's on online on Zoom or Facebook for attending, and I'd really like to thank John Eric for inviting me to come out and give this talk. We're going to talk about the Pennsylvania Reserves today, and that is an organization that I think gets very much overlooked in the modern era. Right? They kind of get denigrated, they get ignored a lot. I was just looking at a map book that was done by ABT that shows a pretty good chunk of the actions that we're going to talk about today. And the reserves were not included on that map at all. So they were noticeably missing. What we are going to talk about today is the Pennsylvania Reserves in the Gettysburg campaign. And I took the title from a quote that is actually given to, I think it's batteries F and G of the 1st Pennsylvania Light Artillery, which was a reserve battery. We'll get into that in a second. At daybreak on July 2nd, 1863, roughly 2,800 dusty Pennsylvanians trudged wearily but steadily westward from McSherrystown, Pennsylvania. They left the defenses of Washington and joined the 5th Army Corps a few days earlier. They lagged behind since catching up with Frederick on June 28th. Other officers of the 5th Corps complained that these men couldn't keep up. It was believed that they were soft from their time in the works around the national capital. But these men were anything but green. They were veterans through and through, and this certainly wasn't their first campaign. They had a fearsome reputation. After all, these were the men who had routed JEB Stuart at Dranesville pretty decisively, killed Turner Ashby at Harrisonburg, held Stonewall Jackson from overrunning Porter's Corps at Mechanicsville, acted as the Army's fire brigade at Gaines's Mill, stemmed the great tide at Charles City Crossroads, with the regulars saved Pope's army from total destruction at 2nd Bull Run, forced Longstreet's left off of South Mountain, made first contact with Antietam, and had broken Jackson's line of Fredericksburg. These men, wearing the sky blue Maltese cross, were the Pennsylvania Reserves. Now, the reserves had been created in May of 1861. They were made up of excess volunteers from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. After Fort Sumter had been fired on, the call went out from the federal government for 75,000 volunteers. So Pennsylvania had been issued a quota for 12 regiments of infantry. They ended up with enough volunteers that they could have made up 40 regiments total. The War Department ended up accepting 25 from Pennsylvania, but what do you do with all these excess volunteers? Well, Governor Curtin, this fellow on the right in this photo, decided that if you just sent them home when the war was inevitably not over in 90 days like everybody expected it to be, you were going to have a much harder time trying to get these men to re-volunteer after their buddies had gone home from 3 months in the Army and let everybody know it really isn't all that much fun. And so Governor Curtin called an emergency session of the legislature together, and on May 15th, 1861, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a bill that created the Pennsylvania Reserve Volunteer Corps. And it was to consist of 13 regiments of infantry, 1 of cavalry, and 1 of artillery. All clothed, fed, armed, equipped, paid for by the state of Pennsylvania. With the idea that they would be in service for 3 years of the war and could be forwarded to the national government if they were required, which they did end up being. And before we go any further, I need to clear up a little issue with numbering conventions. Right? If you go to Gettysburg and you look at any of the monuments for the reserves, you'll see all of the numbers on the left. Right? Most of them will also have the numbers in that center column. The numbers on the left, it doesn't appear that any member of the reserves ever used that as their regimental designation. These were all numbers that were given out by the Adjutant General of Pennsylvania, and it was to sequentially number every regiment that Pennsylvania formed. And if you'll notice, the bottom two, the 43rd and 44th Pennsylvania, were not infantry at all. They were artillery and cavalry, respectively. But every regiment from Pennsylvania was given a sequential number from 1 through, I think it's 219, regardless of what their actual battlefield function is. And so the column in the center, the reserve designations, were ones that were most commonly used. If you look all the way to the right, the 13th reserves were most often referred to as the 1st Pennsylvania Rifles. And then you have the 1st Brigade Light Artillery and the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. And those are the designations that they used most often. So this is what we're going to concern ourselves with today. If you'll notice, the 3rd, 4th, 7th, and 8th reserves aren't listed there. They were not at Gettysburg. We'll get to that. So like I said, the Reserve Division or Reserve Corps is formed in May of 1861. They all come together at various recruiting stations around Pennsylvania, out by Westchester, here in Gettysburg, and then at Harrisonburg were the primary ones. They ended up being forwarded to the national government July 21st, 1861, right after the debacle at First Manassas, because the government figured out that everybody that was at First Manassas were 90-day volunteers, and the majority of them were, and the army was about to go home in a couple of days after a major defeat. And so Simon Cameron, who was a Pennsylvania politician and the then Secretary of War, reached out to Andrew Curtin and requested that he forward the Pennsylvania reserves to Washington. And there was some back and forth between them about the terms that they were going to be taken under. But eventually they did get forwarded to the government. And so they go into camp at Tenleytown, Maryland. They spent a couple of months there. They ultimately moved to what is now the CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. It was a place called Camp Pierpont. And they spent the winter of 61, 62 there. They do have a small part in the Battle of Ball's Bluff, but not because they're actively participating in it, but because the brigade commander at Ball's Bluff was laboring under the mistaken belief that the reserves were on his right at Dranesville when they most assuredly did not. And I don't think he would have committed his brigade quite the way he did if he had known that. But their biggest thing in 1861 was the Battle of Dranesville, December 20th. There was a small scout set out from Camp Pierpont. It consisted of one brigade of the reserves, the rifle regiment, the regiment of cavalry, and one battery of artillery. They went out to Dranesville because there were reports of Confederates operating in the area, and they needed to get forage for animals. So they go out to Dranesville, they find JEB Stuart there with a mixed composition brigade and proceed to stomp his head in. And the rebels quit the field at such a rapid rate, apparently, that they could not be physically caught at a run. So after the winter of 61, 62, in the spring, the army begins to move towards the peninsula. Now, the corps that the reserves were assigned to had been retained at Washington for the defense of the city. And in May, they were forwarded to Falmouth, Virginia. They were kind of at a halfway point between the Army of the Potomac on the peninsula and DC, so they could move in either direction as needed. Part of the reserves were split off. Specifically, 4 companies of the Bucktails and the Cavalry Regiment were sent to the Shenandoah Valley, where Jackson was causing havoc. Long story short, they're involved in the Battle of Harrisonburg, where the 4 companies of Bucktails actually stopped Richard Gould's brigade from moving any further, at least for a time. They killed Turner Ashby there. They're involved in Cross Keys and a couple of other small engagements. The rest of the division goes to the peninsula, where they're heavily involved in 7 days. The 7 days requires a program all of their own, at least as far as the reserves involvement goes. But it is absolutely devastating to those regiments. They account for 1/15 of the Army's combat power during the 7 days. And they end up suffering 1/5 of the Army's casualties. They are decimated, so much so that the 6 companies of Bucktails that went to the peninsula ended up at the end of the 7 days with 64 men. That was it. It was a very devastating time for them. 1862 in general was a harrowing experience for the reserves. After McClellan's army is pulled off the peninsula, the reserves are sent to Pope's army in northern Virginia. At the Battle of Second Manassas, they, along with the division of U.S. regulars, are posted around Henry House Hill to try to stave off Lee's army from being able to cut off and destroy Pope's army at Second Manassas. They go into the defenses of Washington with the rest of the army, and they go into the Maryland campaign. Now, at this point, they left the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in July of 1861 with roughly 15,000 men. And now we're down to roughly 2,500 at the beginning of the Maryland campaign. The army moves west out of DC and into western Maryland. At the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th, the reserves are responsible for turning Longstreet's left flank at a place called Frosttown Gap or Frosttown Plateau. And it's because of that that Longstreet is forced the night of the 14th to quit South Mountain. On September 16th at Antietam, there is not any consequential skirmishing on the north end of the battlefield. Hooker's First Corps is the first one to arrive on the field. They get to essentially the East Woods, and reserves are involved in fairly heavy skirmishing. It is on the 16th that man down there in the bottom center, Hugh McNeil, is killed. He is the regimental commander for the Rifles. On the 17th, the reserves stop Hood's counterattack on the north end of the cornfield. In the process, inflicting 82.6% casualties on 1st Texas and capturing both of their colors, which you can see there on the right-hand side of the screen. At the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13th, this is probably the bloodiest single day for them. It's also probably their best day of fighting in their service, but they are involved in action on Jackson's line on Lee's right at a place called Prospect Hill. It's most commonly known for, they call it, what do they call this, Blood Farm. Anyways, on Prospect Hill, they punch a division-sized hole in Jackson's line, and they hold it for about 20 minutes, but they are unsupported. And so eventually they run out of ammunition and they're driven out of that breach. By the end of Fredericksburg, there are about 2,000 men left in the reserves from the original 13 regiments. And so the War Department takes pity on them in February of 1862 and sends them to the defenses of Washington to rest and recuperate. So they spend February, March, April, May, and June around DC and its environs, doing a lot of guarding railroads, working on different fortifications in the area. But then after the Battle of Chancellorsville, he begins his second invasion of Mohney. And so the Second Pennsylvania Reserves start a petition to the War Department because they want to be sent home to fight. And so the War Department relents. And on June, I'm sorry, we're going to have to go through the commanders. So the commanders of the reserves at this point are Samuel Crawford there on the left. He is not a West Pointer. He was actually a doctor prior to the war. He was the surgeon on staff at Fort Sumter. Buck McCandless, he was a Philadelphian, also not a West Pointer. He was in command of the 1st Brigade. He's the one that we're going to be most discussing today. And then Joseph Fisher, he commanded the 3rd Brigade. We're not going to be able to touch on them very much today, just for time constraints. This is Company K, the 1st Reserves. This was a company that was actually raised in Adams County, and quite a few of them came from Gettysburg itself. And then this is Henry M. Minning. He was the company commander in Gresham, using a fair few pieces of his account. So back to July 2nd. This is from Frank Bell, commanding Company I of the Rifles. We pushed on as long as possible. There's a limit to human endurance. And at last, as the weary men were literally sleeping as they walked, failing at times through sheer exhaustion and drowsiness, a halt was called and the men went down to the work, hardly taking the trouble to leave the dusty track to fall upon the grass by the roadside. The road was blocked with the exhausted sleepers, and orderlies were obliged to tear gaps in the fences and go through the fields to carry orders back and forth. So this was somewhat of a homecoming for Company K. Henry Minnick says this: as we neared Gettysburg, in a number of instances, we passed near the homes of relatives and friends. But with the merest greeting, the boys kept their places in the ranks, reaching the summit of the hill east of the town. The members of the company, with a few exceptions, could see their homes in the village before them, in the immediate vicinity or in the distance, and all of them within the enemy's lines. Now, the Fifth Corps arrived at Gettysburg in the area of Powers Hill around noon on the 2nd, and they were held in reserve there until the afternoon, when George B. called the Fifth Corps forward to support the left end of his line. But this had actually given the men a couple of hours to rest and get something to eat. But at about 4 o'clock, orders came for them to pack up and start moving. Henry Minnick says this: about 4 o'clock, we were hurriedly called into line and ordered to sling knapsacks, which command to us always meant get ready for quick and devilish work. We were hurried to double quick to the extreme left of the round tops to reinforce the Third Corps, which had met with reverses and was being driven by the enemy. Now, the two brigades, they get on the road. They are the 3rd Division of the 5th Corps. They are also the 3rd Division to move forward. The 5th Corps oddly went to the round tops in numerical order. The 3rd Brigade, Fisher's Brigade, led that consisted of the 5th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th reserves. Mechanicsville Brigade came up second with the first, second, 6th, and 13th reserves, the rifles. They came in a line on the northwest slope of Little Round Top, which is what we're looking at here. This photo is from a little bit to the left of where McCandless's brigade would have gone into line. But you're looking west from the north slope of Little Round Top, across that knoll in the center distance to the wheat field, which you can just barely see is that cutout in the far distance. But at this point, the U.S. regulars have gone into the wheat field. They're being driven out. George Stout, the Sergeant Major of the 11th U.S., said this: on the 2nd of July, our regiment, then belonging to the 2nd Brigade, 2nd Division, 5th Corps, moved from the northwest slope of Little Round Top nearly to the wheat field, where it changed direction to the left and was advancing in this new direction when our right flank was turned by the Confederates. We fell back in great confusion and were driven to Little Round Top, followed by the enemy that had been in our front and those on our flank. And this is George Stout on the right. This rock in the photo on the left, the man leaning against it on the right of that photo is George Stout himself. And he was wounded on July 2nd, laid behind that rock. He was ordered there by Confederates who were pursuing the regulars, and he witnessed the charge of the reserves. The timely arrival of the reserves must have struck a devastatingly demoralizing blow to the rebels. They had fought hard for hours by then and had broken what they believed to be the last organized resistance in their front. Now, with success in sight, more federal troops appeared to block their path. Was there any end to the flow of Yankees, or was there an inexhaustible reserve behind that hill? For their part, the men of the reserves could do little to stem the great tide until the regulars had cleared their front. All they could do for the time being was watch, wait, and incur casualties. So this map is actually, this is a satellite image of the area that we're talking about. Right here, that yellow line, that is the stone wall that's going to be referred to. That area highlighted in yellow at the top, that is the Whitebird Farm, and what we're going to be talking about. And then the regiments went into line like this. So from right to left in the first line was the 6th Reserves, the 11th, and the 1st. The second line consisted of the 2nd Reserves on the right and the Rifles on the left. Frank Bell, Company I, 1st Rifles, says this: members of the 14th Regulars came stumbling back over us as we lay huddled on the ground, closely, to avoid the shower of bullets. And some of our men, among the number, Captain Hugh McDonald of Company G, was wounded, the captain receiving a ball, which laid his scalp open and stunned him for the time. The regulars were being closely pursued by all or part of 4 brigades. They were Walker, Kershaw, Semmes, and Benning's brigades. They had all managed to funnel themselves into the wheat field from different places. Benning's brigade had primarily attacked Devil's Den to the south of the wheat field, but his left flank, at least one of the regiments, had kind of found their way to the south edge of the wheat field. And so they kind of joined in on this. Frank Bell says this: a brass piece in our immediate front on the edge of the crest, which had been worked with for all its worth, but was deserted now, saved by the dead and wounded. When at last the boys of the 2nd Division had passed over us and we rose to our feet, one of the pursuers had clambered so closely after them that he had his hands on that gun and was calling for his companions to come and help him turn it on us. I remember firing at him with my pistol without waiting for orders. And after our colonel's order, up boys and at him. The men opened promptly with their breech loaders, checking the advance of the enemy who swarmed in the valley in front. And it was but a few moments before they began to give ground. The retiring of the 2nd Division allowed some guns on our right to be brought into play, and the Napoleon, which the bold Frederick designed to turn upon us, was again manned and worked with a vengeance. That battery that they're referring to is Battery L, 1st Ohio. There were 2 sections on the south side of the Wheatfield Road. So if you look at the line of the reserves there, they were kind of to their front and center of that line. And then there was another section to their right, a place that's now called Mud Showers and Knoll. And that's going to become an issue shortly. But the regulars by cleared the canvases front, that opened up his brigade to be able to do something about these rebels. And so McCandless says this in his report: as soon as our front was uncovered, the brigade advanced in gallant style, the first time delivering one volley, then the whole brigade charged with a full run down the hillside and across the plain, driving the advancing masses of the enemy back upon the stone wall, for the possession of which there was a desperate struggle, we finally carrying it. Prior to reaching the wall, however, my left flank being exposed to a galling fire, I deployed the 2nd line, viz. The 1st Rifles and 2nd Regiment to the left, forming a prolongation of my 1st line, along with which they steadily advanced. And to simplify that, there's the advance of the reserves, more or less. About halfway across the valley at Plum Run, the 2nd and 1st Rifles had to be pushed to the left because on their left, you can see it marked there, at Devil's Den, there were rebels firing to the left flank, and they had to do something about it. Frank Donaldson from 118th Pennsylvania, who witnessed this, said, our regiment continued to fall back slowly for a few minutes longer when all at once it was brought to a standstill by a yell so fierce and terrible that the very blood seemed to curdle in our veins, while the sound as of a hurricane was swept toward us. It was the crushing of leaves and twigs made by the Pennsylvania reserves coming over the mass at the double, arms at the right shoulder, bayonets fixed, and with General Crawford on horseback at their head, hat in hand, waving it excitedly as he led the most terrific charge I ever witnessed. With diabolical screeches and shouts, they pressed forward. When they got to the area of Plum Run, the 6th Reserves were on our right flank and to take fire from the White Farm, that area that's highlighted in yellow at the top center of the map. There were about a dozen Confederates that were pulled up in what was then the White House, which no longer exists. It was a log house, and 6 men ended up volunteering to go clear that house out. There was some debate as to whether or not the 6th Corps should have been there, but I don't believe they were that. But in any case, George Mears, this gentleman here on the left, led that little party, and for his efforts, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, and so were the other 5 gentlemen. So there were 6 men from 6 reserves who were awarded the Medal of Honor for July 2nd. Gettysburg. The battlefield is almost by design a chaotic maelstrom packed full of adrenaline and anxiety, where confusion reigns supreme. 19th century battlefields had the additional hindrance of poor visibility. Heavy clouds of smoke and burning black powder could and often did cling to the field like a dense fog. The deafening roar of artillery and musketry, the screams of wounded men and horses, the flash and concussion of exploding shells, the smoke, all of it combined to create the perfect conditions for incidents of fratricide. Frank Bell from the Rifles said this: as we halted after our run to look about, I noticed that the shells from our own cannon were cutting the timber overhead. But it so happened that the greater portion of our regiment had stopped at the stone wall. An unlucky shell struck the fence and exploding wounded half a dozen of our men. The smoke had settled so thickly in the valley that our gunners on the crest could not see where we were and could not tell when to stop firing. This is probably that right section from Battery Hill, 1st Ohio. William Rout, who wrote the Bucktail Regimental History, he kind of elaborated a little bit. A shell from the rear passed over the heads of Company C. One of the men said, "Captain, that means us." The captain replied, "No, that is one of our own shells, and it's meant for those fellows in the rocks." A moment later, another shell came, taking off the arm of Company B boy. The boy sprang up crying, "I won't die, I won't die." Then for a moment he ran in a circle, the blood spurting from the stump before he dropped dead. The same shell also killed a man from Company I, hit the ball, throwing part of it up in the air, and wounded 7 or 8 men. Captain Kinsey's right arm and left wrist were cut, and the fingers of his left hand torn and lacerated, forcing him a few moments later to retire to the hospital in the rear. The 6 reserves on the opposite end of the line also had their fair share of casualties. Silas Crocker from Company I, 6 reserves said, "Robert Shortell was our company clerk and did not carry a musket for a long time, but on the march to Gettysburg, he had picked up a carbine and said he intended to help fight the rebels out of his native state. He went in with us and was struck by a canister shot in the groin and died next morning." Now, the Rifles, on the left were contending with rebels in Rose's Woods to their front, Devil's Den on the left. And it was about this time that their regimental commander, Colonel Taylor, was killed. Colonel Taylor attempted to give an order with a long run through the smoke battle that parched his throat, but his almost husky voice could not be heard. I stepped upon a rock which brought the canteen on my back up where he could drink. And after quenching his thirst, he gave an order which I repeated as loud as I could. By the left flank march. We had both noticed the squads of the enemy coming back into the timber, endeavoring to reload as they came. And the idea was to head them off and capture them. As I sprang from the rock to lead this movement, the gallant colonel fell, shot through the heart by some riflemen who doubtless fired at me as I stood in relief upon the rock. Colonel Taylor was killed. It was left to Major Hartshorn to command the regiment. He actually ended up commanding the regiment through the rest of their term of service. Now the line of reserve settled in on the stone wall and commenced skirmishing with rebels across the wheat field and also in Devil's Den on the left. The left 3 companies of the Rifles had to be refused, so essentially brought to a 90-degree angle perpendicular to the rest of the line. So that they could face the rebels in the Devil's Den and not be completely inflated. But skirmishing continued through the evening, by some accounts as late as midnight, when it kind of petered out for the evening. Now the wounded in the wheat field, and there were plenty of them, had a very rough go of it. Lieutenant Inman from the 118th Pennsylvania left his account. Lieutenant Wilson and myself were wounded, and I lay upon the field until the morning of the 4th, when some of the men in Company F, of which I was an officer, carried me off on a stretcher to the hospital, where Dr. Thomas operated. On Thursday night, whilst lying within the rebel lines, the 139th Pennsylvania Regiment, came to where I was, and I quietly called one of the sergeants, and asked him to help me into our lines. He reported to the colonel the fact of being within the enemy's lines, when he immediately ordered right about face and fell rapidly back, leaving me alone with the dead. That night, a number of stray hogs came in where I lay and commenced rooting and tearing at the dead man around me. Finally, one fellow who in the darkness looked of enormous size approached and attempted to poke me, grunting loudly the while. Several others also came up, and awaiting my chance, I jammed my sword into his belly, which made him set up a prolonged sharp cry. By constant vigilance and keeping from sleeping, I contrived to fight the monsters off till daylight. Now, attempts were being made through the night to either recover or give the wounded succor. And E.M. Woodward, the adjutant in Second Reserves, in his history of the regiment, said, down the center of the meadow we crossed, ran a small creek, Plum Run, and two of the thirsty ones prepared to fill their canteens. It was found almost choked with the dead and wounded who had fallen in while attempting to cross. It was the only place from which we could get water. After this, we set to work gathering our wounded and those of other regiments who had been driven from the field and who lay thick in every direction. This work occupied many of us most of the night, but it was light labor to relieve the sufferings of our tormentors. But as so often in life, no good deed goes unpunished. And there were a couple of instances of men trying to give wounded water, being shot down for it. Frank Bell from the Rifles said the other matter was due to a wounded man who belonged to some Confederate regiment, the 20th Georgia, I think. He lay on the edge of the grain field in the debatable ground between the lines, calling so piteously for water that one of our men spoke to him, saying, I would bring you a drink, but your men would shoot me. Go ahead, Hank, we won't shoot, was the prompt reply. On this assurance, our man advanced to the sufferer and had just raised his head to give him a drink when a shot from the enemy struck him in the head. As we saw him fall, a regular fusillade began, and there was no more truce on that line. The First Reserves also reported a similar instance. Benjamin Urban from Company D, he said, Sergeant McMahon, moved by a brave and generous impulse to aid a wounded man, laid down his gun, holding up his hand as a token that he was only intent on a mission of peace and mercy. He left the protection of the stone wall, carrying a cup of water to the parched lips of a sorely wounded rebel lying in front of the line. While stooping over the body of his death-stricken foe, in his ministration of pity, a dastardly rebel sharpshooter nearby sent the ball crashing through his face. And although swift and sure vengeance followed the cowardly act, for in a minute his carcass, pierced by more than one avenging bullet, tumbled from a treetop. Such a deed could not be atoned for. And oh, how merciful it would have been if that shot had then and there ended McMahon's sufferings and death. For the sad sequel to it was that after years of untold agonies caused by him, the poor sergeant, driven by the madness of pain and distress, ended his own life. Now, the men laid there on the line along Stonewall on their skirmish line at their front for the entire evening. A heavy line of pickets had gone forward. Generally, the rule of thumb was about 10% of each regiment. Bucktails on the left sent 3 full companies. And so things, when you're close to the enemy in the dark, can get a little weird, for lack of a better term. And so Frank Bell, who was commanding the skirmish line for the rifle regiment, had kind of a strange incident happen. Another singular thing happened during the night. The entire left of my line of pickets quit their posts, one after the other, without orders, and skulked to the rear. An unaccountable panic seemed to seize them, and the same men who had so fearlessly faced death in the daylight, not only that day, but over many hard-fought fields before, now ran away in such a disgraceful manner as to justify the truth of the old adage, that we are all cowards in the dark. Sergeant L.B. Prosser was standing with me near the center of the line when the brave occurred and asked me if I should shoot them. No, I said, save your fire for the enemy, and I would go out along there and see what has started. I went to the fence and discerned nothing moving in the field beyond, and returned to the sergeant only to find men all coming back in a body, asking me not to report them and promising to stick to their posts in the future. So when you're in close proximity and somebody sees something that moves that maybe didn't, they decide to get out of there, and then the people on their left and right start to do the same. The firing began again early in the morning on July 3rd. More or less as the first streaks of light started to come across the sky. And Benjamin Early from the 1st Reserve says, as the gray of the morning was paling in the east, the firing began. First from the Devil's Den, and soon spread to the skirmish line in front of us, where my brother John was, he having insisted on taking my place the evening before. I well remember being about half awake, hearing someone near me saying, "There it goes." I thought it would begin again with daylight. And when more fully aroused by the stirring about me, I sat up cold and shivering, my teeth chattering like an old lawnmower in action. Captain Wasson, every kind and considerate, seeing my evident attempts to control it, said, "Never mind that, Benny. You can't help it." Some more of us are in the same fix, and as misery loves company, I was almost glad to see that others were about as uncomfortable as I was. Now, much of the day on July 3rd was spent skirmishing. In the morning, there were several attempts, 3 specifically made by the rifle regiment on the left, to try to push Confederates out of Devil's Den, or at least move their line back far enough so that they would be a little bit more comfortable. That didn't really happen until around noon. Preparations really began in earnest for what we call Pickett's Charge now. And Longstreet's Corps started to pull most of their line back, leaving Benning's brigade in and around Devil's Den and Rosa's Hole. Now, William Rout, who wrote the Bucktail Regimental History, said about noon, Lieutenant Prosser with Company K made another attempt to clear the den of the Confederates, deploying his men as skirmishers. He changed from forward at a run. When but a few feet separated them from their antagonists, the Confederates, springing from their cover, greeted them with a murderous fire, while an officer called on Prosser to surrender. The answer was a revolver shot. The Confederate returned the shot, and Prosser, firing again, though within the elbow, killed him. But that kind of ended their push to clear Devil's Den, at least for the time being. As I said, preparations were already fairly underway for Pickett's Charge, but that doesn't mean that the day was not without its share of tragedies. From the 1st Reserve, Benjamin Urban says, our regiment was broken about the center by a large flat rock against which the wall butted on both sides, and it was here that poor Charlie Townsend invited his own tragic death. No one ever knew why he did it, but probably impelled by one of those inexplicable impulses that sometimes control human actions and which some people call fate. He deliberately stepped on the rock and looked out over the field. In a moment, a rifle ball struck him fairly in the forehead, and his quivering corpse was hurled backward for a distance of 8 or 10 feet. The last office of comradeship, except his hasty burial afterward, and which was one of necessity rather than a friendship I did for him, when I went to his body and placed the velvet cap he had worn over his ghastly face. Pickett's Charge happens in the afternoon of the 3rd. The reserves are not involved in Pickett's Charge, of course, they're too far south. But afterward, there was an unofficial council of war between me, a couple of his corps commanders, his chief of engineers, his chief of cavalry on the Round Top. And if you go there today, which you can now because it's open again, on the monument for the 146th New York, there's actually an annotation on the bottom of their monument that says that we watched a portion of the battle from that position. They're not talking about Pickett's Charge, they're talking about the actions on the south end of the field on the evening of the 3rd. So Farnsworth's charge of cavalry and what is going to be the advance of the reserves through the wheat field. And so Samuel Crawford, in command of the division, said this about that. At 5 o'clock on the 3rd, I received orders from General Sykes, commanding the corps, to advance that portion of my command, which was holding the ground retaken on the left, and which still held the line of the stone wall in front, to enter the woods and, if possible, drive out the enemy. It was supposed that the enemy evacuated the position. And so there's some speculation as to what he really intended for this movement. It was certainly a reconnaissance in force, but there is some speculation that it was reconnaissance in force preparatory to a forward movement of his left flank, which would have consisted of primarily the 5th Corps, but also portions of the 6th, which had come up. Benning's brigade was still occupying Devil's Den and Rose's Woods, though they had begun to pull out by the time this movement was ordered. But there was a mix-up in orders whereby the 15th Georgia was actually sent forward into Rose's Woods and was never given an order to withdraw. And so the reserves began to move. Right, so here we are, the reserves are on the line of the Stonewall. That big open section in the center, that is the wheat field, and that large patch of woods on the bottom side of the photo, that is Rose's Woods. The enemy held their ground so stubbornly as to fairly exasperate our men. Excuse me. So anyways, there's skirmishers from Wofford's brigade across the wheat field on Stony Hill, along with at least one gun, if not a section, of Confederate artillery that had been firing in the 6th Reserves for a pretty good chunk of the morning. The orders ended up being for the 6th and 11th Reserves to advance across the wheat field, more or less parallel with the wheat field road. The left 3 regiments, the 1st, 2nd, and Rifles, were to wheel to their south and clear Rose's Woods as far south as Devil's Den, which they did do. And that's basically how that movement went. The enemy held their ground so stubbornly as to fairly exasperate our men, and one of them, who had fired his rifle in the faces of the boys as they were advancing, and then threw up his hands as he lay on the ground crying, "I surrender," was dispatched by Lieutenant Ward of our regiment, who blew his brains out with his pistol, crying, "You can't shoot and surrender in that way." Now, there was 1 gun and 3 caissons from the 9th Massachusetts battery that had been recaptured by the 6th and 11th Reserves over around Stony Hill. Roughly 300 prisoners were taken, 3,672 stands of arms, and James Thompson from the Rifles was awarded the Medal of Honor for capturing the colors of the 15th Georgia in Rose's Woods. After that movement, as evening came on fairly in earnest, the reserves were advanced out almost as far as the Emmitsburg Road, where they bivouacked for the evening. On July 4th, they were withdrawn to the rear of Little Round Top, and Company K of the 1st Reserves, who were again from Gettysburg, took the opportunity to cut out and go visit home. Now, almost every man from the company returned. There was one fellow who was 17 at the time who failed to. He ended up coming back to the Army a couple of months afterwards, finished his term of service, re-enlisted, and was captured and died in prison in '64. But soldiers can find humor in some very dark situations. I don't know if anybody out here is a veteran. But combat veterans especially, they can find some rather odd things funny. Silas Crocker from Company I of the 6th Reserves wrote, someone of our company had captured an old horse on the road, and we conceived the idea of turning him into a baggage wagon. So we hung and tied all our shelter tents and blankets on him, and gave him in charge of Uncle Dan Cole, well, in March. Cole was a member of the company, but for some reason was off duty at the time. He came on the field just after the charge I referred to, riding the old horse. The rebels, taking him probably for an officer, began firing at him in a lively manner, upon which Uncle Dan slid to the ground to seek shelter and let the horse go. The old fellow went on in a trot right into the rebel line and yells of laughter from all who witnessed it from either side, And we had to admit that the rebels had captured at least one baggage train at Gettysburg, but had the satisfaction of knowing that the driver escaped unhurt. So total losses for Mechanicsville's brigade at Gettysburg came to 205. 22 killed, 21 mortally wounded, 158 wounded, 2 captured and 2 missing. Frank Bell, whose account we've listened to quite a bit of, he was among the wounded. He ended up losing a leg. During one of those pushes to the Devil's Den, he was on the retreat back to their main line when he was shot through the heel, which ended up shattering the lower part of his leg. He was amputated the rest of the leg. He eventually transferred to the Veteran Reserve Corps. But the division went on to fight with the Army of the Potomac through the rest of their term of service, which ended June 1st, 1864. And their last day in service, the last full day in service, happened to be the Battle of Bethesda Church. And there were a number of men who were set to go home the following day, who were captured, sent to rebel prisons, and ended up dying in prison in the South. Long after they were supposed to go home. The division started the war with 14,370 men. 1,300 re-enlisted into the 190th and 191st Pennsylvania. And that left roughly 1,500 men to go home in June 1864 to be mustered out of service. So just over 10% of the men who left in July of 1861 came back in June of 1864. It was a devastating, absolutely appalling period for these men. And I tried to come up with a way to end this with my own words, but as I've done with most of this program, I can use somebody else's. Henry Minnick from Company K, he wrote a history of Company K, the first reserves, after the war in 1890. And the way he closed his narrative on their term of service, I thought was excellent, very poignant. He wrote, "It would be in vain for me to attempt a proper eulogium of the character of these fallen heroes. They gave up the fair promise of a useful life, gave up chances of fame, I gave up life for the salvation of the common country. In what light can I set the high mark of their patriotism? What words can tell the story of their courage? With what language can I adorn their lofty heroism? How valiantly they fought, how serenely and sublimely they died. They fell in the fierce conflict amid the cheers, the smoke, the flame, soothed in the dying hour by the consciousness that victory came to the side of right and truth and liberty. And that old glory will still wave triumphantly. They have pitched their tents in the eternal bivouac among the stars and are camped in the mysterious and unknown silence of the life and war. Oh, unconquerable heroes, let it never be said that the great republic is forgetful of your deeds or unmindful of those whom you love most. Finally, my comrades, let us valiantly on all the stern battlefields of this life, so that when the last tattoo is beaten and lights out forever, we shall be worthy to join the immortal ranks of the comrades on the other side and march before the great reviewing officer when time and earth and hostile armies are no more forever." Thank you. All right, so now the easy part, the part that I'm the best at, answering questions. What are your questions?
What's the distinction between regulars and the reserves? I mean,
Okay.
does this fit in there?
Right, so the distinction between the regulars and the reserves, the regulars were federal troops, they always were. Whereas the reserves were state volunteers. They were treated the same as any other state volunteer regiment. The only difference is their designation, right? So they always refer to themselves as, you know, first, second, third, fourth, seventh, eighth, blah, 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 reserves, right? They did have that extra number that I said about earlier from the Adjutant General's office, but they never really used that. You'll see them on their monuments at Gettysburg and Antietam, but that's because there was a requirement from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania when they voted to fund all of that monument building, that they would be required to have their Adjutant General's office designation, their line designation. So back to your question, though, the difference between the regulars and the reserves. The regulars were always federal troops like the regular army was now, and then the reserves were state volunteers. They just had a weird name. Maybe yes, sir.
You had a pretty, you had a picture up earlier of that really impressive lake that's down below, on top. Why don't we have any good accounts of, you know, these guys fording or swimming that lake?
Oh man, I'm gonna be goaded into this. That's because that wasn't there. Let me go back. We'll find that photo real quick. And I did purposely include that in this. Right, so this is actually a postcard. This is going to be essentially the same view of the next photo, but this is from the 1890s-ish, might be 1900, well, 1904, according to the copyright. If you look down into the valley on Crawford Avenue, you'll see no bodies of water, and that's because at the time, and through most of its history, there was just a run. Now it was a little soupy up on the north end where the reserves crossed, but nothing like what I witnessed in July, which is a substantial beaver pond. And I'm gonna fix that for your own sake. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Second brigade.
The second brigade, all right, so part of the agreement that the War Department came up with, because the reserves are petitioning to go home with the Army of the Potomac and fight, but the War Department couldn't very well strip everyone out of the defenses of Washington. So the second brigade, the third, fourth, seventh, and eighth reserves were left at Washington. And they never actually rejoined the rest of the division. It's odd, they have the divergent history after the Battle of Fredericksburg. They end up fighting in the valley at the end of 63 and through early 64. The 7th and 8th reserves are sent back to the rest of the division at the end of the beginning of the Overland campaign. But the 3rd and 4th ended their term of service at the Battle of Boyd's Mountain. In Western Virginia, and then the men who re-enlisted from that regiment, those two regiments, were rolled into the 54th Brigade. So the 3rd and 4th reserves, after June of 64, what remained of them carried on with the 54th Brigade. The rest of the division ended up re-enlisting, and there weren't enough of them re-enlist. There weren't, frankly, enough of them left to do anything with realistically. The men who re-enlisted became the 190th and 191st Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteers. And if you look at their state issued colors, it actually says the first Veteran Regiment Pennsylvania Reserves and second regiment Veteran Reserves. But they didn't last very long either. At the Battle of Belton Railroad in August of 64, almost the entirety of those two regiments was captured. So the 1,300 men from the original reserves who re-enlisted, became the 190th and 191st PA, were ultimately captured and spent the bulk of the rest of the war in prisons in the South. So after August of 1864, the reserves kind of well and truly ceased to exist. Those regiments did carry on in designation, but they ended up being backfilled with men who had enlisted in regiments that mustered out but didn't they hadn't completed their individual service obligations. There were later on in early '65, there were a bunch of leftovers from 114th Pennsylvania that had been mustered out that were rolled into them. And so they really well and truly were no longer the reserve, even though they carried that designation. I hope that answered your question. I won't ramble too much. Anything else? Yes, sir.
From today's perspective, the reserves and the National Guard, and the National Guard be called up prior to the, like, reserve command.
Oh, sure. The National Guard, right, the National Guard kind of operates the same way as the Pennsylvania Reserves did, right? They originally enlisted for state service, but were mustered into federal service because the federal government required it. The same can be done with the National Guard now, under kind of the same process, right? The no longer the War Department, it's the Department of Defense now says, we need X number of men of this specialty, or we need, you know, these battalions, these brigades, these divisions for federal service, and they'll activate the ability for a very specific period of time. I think now it's no longer than it's for sure no longer than 18 months. It might be as little as 12. But yeah, the guard now can be activated the same way the Pennsylvania Reserves were back in 1861. Yes, sir.
Okay, you explained the difference between the veteran reserve and the regular. But what was the difference between the veteran reserve and the other Pennsylvania volunteer regiments? 83 Pennsylvania, Gettysburg.
So the difference between the reserves and the rest of Pennsylvania state volunteers. Right, so there really isn't any, other than their numeric designation. The other thing that is kind of, not kind of, is this is the only instance that I know of that happened during the entire war. The Pennsylvania Reserves remained a homogeneous unit. There were never any regiments from even another state added to it. There was only one period after the Battle of Antietam through Fredericksburg until they were pulled out of the Army of the Potomac in February of '63. There was that one, like 4 or 5 month period where the 121st and 142nd Pennsylvania were added to the reserves, basically because numerically they almost didn't exist anymore. You know, the division went into battle at Fredericksburg with roughly 4,000 men, but again, there's 2 brand new regiments in there. They make up almost half of the division's combat power, and the other half is 13 regiments, right? These are very small organizations by this. But back to your initial question, yeah, there's no difference between the reserves and the normal state volunteer regiments, other than their designation and the fact that they were kept as a homogeneous unit through their term of enlistment. Yes, sir. Any other questions? Cool.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.